In 1859, somewhere in the American South, a plantation owner looked at his disabled son and made a decision that would destroy 3 lives. The son couldn't walk. 3 doctors said he probably couldn't reproduce. The family line was dying. So the father did what plantation owners had done for 240 years. He chose the strongest enslaved woman on his plantation, a woman who'd survived things that killed most, and he gave her an order that no one could refuse. This is the story of how slavery didn't just steal labor. It stole bodies, it stole choices, it stole the most intimate parts of human existence. And it did it all legally, systematically, for generations. If you're ready for the truth, stay with me. Because this story, documented, verified, impossible to forget, shows you what slavery really meant. If this is your first time here, this channel tells original slave stories, 100% verified, no speculation, no made-up dialogue, just documented history that's more powerful than fiction. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Let's start with the son. We'll call him Thomas, not his real name, but representative of documented cases found in plantation records, family letters, and estate inventories across the South. Thomas was 23 years old in 1859. He'd been paralyzed since childhood. Scarlet fever at age 6 left his legs weak, useless. He spent his days in a wooden wheelchair with metal wheels that scraped across the floors of his father's plantation house. His older brother had died 2 years earlier. His mother was dead. He was the last male heir, and according to 3 different doctors, including one brought from the nearest city at great expense, Thomas was probably sterile. The childhood fever had damaged more than his legs. Here's what you need to understand about plantation inheritance in 1859. Everything depended on legitimate male heirs. If a plantation owner died without sons, his property, land, buildings, enslaved people, everything passed to cousins, brothers-in-law, distant relatives. The family name died. The legacy ended. For plantation owners, this was unacceptable. So they found solutions. And in the world of American slavery, solutions meant using enslaved people however they wanted. Thomas's father, we'll call him William, looked at his disabled son and saw a problem that could be solved with property he already owned. Now let's talk about Sarah. Again, not her real name, but based on documented women in WPA slave narratives and plantation records. Sarah was 32 years old in 1859. She was what plantation owners called a prime hand. Strong enough to outwork 2 men, resilient enough to survive conditions that killed others. She stood nearly 6 feet tall. She could carry sacks of cotton that made grown men stumble. She'd survived a husband's lynching, 2 children who didn't live past infancy, and 32 years of labor that would have destroyed most people. Plantation owners kept detailed records of their enslaved people, just like they kept records of livestock. In one surviving plantation ledger from 1850s Virginia, an enslaved woman is described as strong breeding woman, 30 years, 5 children born, 3 living, good health, worth $1,200. That's what Sarah was to William. Not a person, not a human being with thoughts, feelings, dreams, a resource, an asset, a solution to his son's problem. And here's the documented truth about slavery that most history books skip. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse sexual advances. 0. This is confirmed in state slave codes across the South, court cases where enslaved women tried to prosecute rape, always rejected. Countless slave narratives describing forced breeding. Plantation records that tracked increase, children born, like livestock production. Sally Hemings, the enslaved woman who bore Thomas Jefferson's children, couldn't refuse him. She was his property. The thousands of mixed-race children born on Southern plantations didn't exist because of love stories. They existed because enslaved women had no choice. And Sarah, in 1859, facing William's order, had no choice either. Here's what happened next. Based on documented cases, William called Sarah to the main house. He explained the situation with brutal clarity. His son needed an heir. She was strong, healthy, proven fertile. She would go to Thomas's quarters each night until she became pregnant. If she conceived a boy, she would be moved to easier work, fed better food, given better quarters. The child would be recognized as a Ballard heir, William's grandson, legitimate under plantation law. If she refused, her rations would be cut in half. She'd be assigned to the hardest field work. When she became too weak to be useful, she'd be sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the average enslaved person survived 3 years. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an order, backed by the full legal weight of American slavery. And here's what makes this even more horrifying: this was common. Historians estimate that between 1619 and 1865, millions of enslaved women were subjected to forced breeding, sexual coercion, or encouragement to have children who would increase their master's wealth. In 1858, one Virginia plantation owner wrote in his journal, "Have placed Lucy with Big John for breeding purposes. Expect good results by autumn." In 1842, a South Carolina planter's letter described, "My best policy is to pair my best female slaves with my strongest bucks. Have seen 15% increase in property value in just 5 years. These are primary sources, not speculation, not exaggeration." This was how slavery actually worked. So when William ordered Sarah to Thomas's quarters, he wasn't doing anything unusual. He was following a 240-year-old playbook written by thousands of plantation owners before him. That first night, Sarah walked to Thomas's small room in the west wing of the plantation house. She'd been given orders. Thomas had been given orders. Both of them were trapped, in different ways, but trapped nonetheless. Here's where the story gets complicated. Thomas hadn't chosen this. He'd argued with his father, saying it was wrong, inhuman, impossible. But William had responded with a truth that Thomas couldn't escape. "You are my son, she is my property, this is how we preserve our family." So Thomas sat in his wheelchair, looking at Sarah, knowing that both of them were powerless victims of the same brutal system. And Sarah, who'd survived everything else slavery had thrown at her, faced this final violation of her bodily autonomy. Based on slave narratives, we know what enslaved women thought in these moments. One woman in the WPA narratives recalled, "Master said I had to go with Buck Tom for breeding. I cried all night, but ain't no use crying when you's property." Another remembered, "They paired us like animals, called it encouraging increase, but it was rape, always was." Sarah likely felt the same rage, the same helplessness, the same dehumanization. But she also knew something else. Survival meant compliance. Fight back, and you'd be whipped. Refuse, and you'd be sold. Run, and you'd be caught, returned, and punished publicly as a warning to others. So she did what enslaved women had done for 240 years. She survived the only way she could. Over the next weeks and months, something unexpected happened. Sarah and Thomas began to talk, not as master and slave. That power dynamic never disappeared, but as two people trapped in the same impossible situation. Thomas taught Sarah to read, which was illegal in most southern states. Sarah told Thomas about her life, the husband she'd lost, the children who'd died, the survival strategies that had kept her alive. And slowly, against all logic and morality of the situation, a kind of understanding developed. This is crucial to understand. Their relationship, if you can even call it, that was never equal. Thomas had power, Sarah didn't. Thomas could walk away figuratively, Sarah couldn't. Thomas would always be free. Sarah would always be enslaved. But within that horrifying power imbalance, two human beings found ways to assert their humanity. This is documented in several slave narratives where enslaved women describe complex relationships with the men. Enslaved or free, they were forced to be with. He wasn't cruel like the others. He talked to me like I was human. But I never forgot, he still owned me. Some nights we'd just sit and talk, he taught me my letters. But every morning I woke up a slave. These relationships existed in a moral gray zone that modern people struggle to understand. They weren't love stories, they weren't chosen. But they were human beings finding humanity in an inhuman system. 4 months into the arrangement, Sarah missed her monthly cycle. By month 5, there was no doubt. She was pregnant. William was euphoric. The plantation would have an heir. The family name would continue. He immediately improved Sarah's conditions: better food, lighter work, a private room. But he also made something brutally clear: the child would belong to the Ballard family, not to Sarah. Under slave law, children followed the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, the master's property from birth. But William planned to recognize this child as legitimate, a rare but documented practice when plantation owners needed heirs desperately. Here's what the historical record shows about this. In 1850s Virginia, one plantation owner wrote, "Have decided to recognize the boy born to my property, Jenny, as my grandson, given my son's incapacity. The child will inherit, though his mother remains enslaved." In 1840s South Carolina, court records show a case where a disabled heir's child by an enslaved woman was legally recognized, inheriting the plantation while his mother was sold south. This was possible because 1. Plantation owners controlled local courts. 2. Inheritance law favored keeping property in white families. 3. Racial classifications were flexible when wealth was at stake, so Sarah carried a child who would legally be her master's heir, a child she would birth, nurse, and then lose. Because that was the deal. 9 months of pregnancy in exchange for better treatment. A child in exchange for survival. It was exploitation disguised as opportunity, and Sarah had no choice but to accept it. In the spring of 1860, Sarah went into labor. It lasted 16 hours. A midwife, another enslaved woman, attended her. William paced outside. Thomas waited in his wheelchair, terrified. When the baby finally came, a boy healthy and screaming, William's reaction was immediate. "That's my grandson. That's the Ballard heir." He took the baby from Sarah's arms within hours, hired a wet nurse from town, moved the child to a nursery in the main house. Sarah was allowed to see her son, named William Jr., only when nursing was required. The rest of the time, he was property of the Ballard family. Based on slave narratives, we know what this felt like. One woman remembered, "They took my baby soon as he was born, said he was too valuable to be raised in slave quarters. I saw him every day, but he wasn't mine, never was." Another recalled, "I birthed 7 children. Master sold 6, kept 1 to raise as house servant. That one hurt most, seeing him every day, not being his mama." Sarah experienced both traumas, seeing her child daily, but not being allowed to mother him. And the legal documents made it official. William Jr. was recorded as Thomas Ballard's son, legitimate heir to the plantation. Sarah was recorded as breeding woman, successfully produced male heir, value increased to $1,500. That's how slavery worked. Children as products, mothers as factories, humanity erased by ledger entries and legal documents. Here's where we reach the most morally complicated part of this story. After William Sr. saw the baby, he made Sarah an offer. "After the child is weaned, roughly 3 years, you'll be manumitted, freed, given papers, and a small sum of money to start elsewhere." Manumission was rare but documented. Some plantation owners freed enslaved people in wills, or as rewards for exceptional service, or to solve complicated inheritance problems. For Sarah, this meant freedom. But it also meant leaving her son forever, because the child would remain with the Ballard family, raised as a white heir, with no legal connection to his enslaved mother. Choice, freedom without your child, or slavery with your child, was one thousands of enslaved women faced. Some chose freedom, carrying the guilt forever. Some chose to stay enslaved, just to be near their children. Neither choice was really a choice. Both were traumas inflicted by a system that treated human beings as negotiable assets. Sarah faced this decision every day for 3 years. Thomas, guilt-ridden, powerless, promised her something. "When my father dies, when I inherit, I'll bring you back. I'll make sure you know your son." But promises from slave owners, even well-meaning ones, were worth nothing, because the system was bigger than any individual's good intentions. In 1863, Sarah was manumitted. She left the plantation with $50, a set of clothes, and freedom papers. She never saw her son again. William Jr. grew up as a Ballard. He was taught to read, write, manage the plantation. He inherited everything. When William Sr. died in 1868, Thomas tried to keep his promise. He searched for Sarah for years. But in the chaos of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the collapse of the plantation system, she disappeared into the millions of newly freed Black Americans trying to build lives from nothing. And William Jr.? He never knew his real mother's name. The family told him she'd been a servant who died in childbirth. That lie, like so many lies about slavery, was easier than the truth. Here's what the historical record confirms. Thousands of children born from these forced arrangements grew up never knowing their enslaved mothers. Thousands of enslaved women were promised freedom in exchange for bearing their masters' heirs. And some got it, but lost their children forever. Thousands of disabled or infertile white men used enslaved women to solve their inheritance problems, then erased those women from family history. This wasn't an isolated case. This was systemic. It happened on plantations across the South for 240 years with the full backing of American law. And then, after emancipation, those stories were buried. Families rewrote their histories. Plantation records were destroyed. Official narratives claimed slavery was just about labor. But slavery was never just about labor. It was about total control over human beings. Their work, their bodies, their children, their very existence. So here's what this story teaches us. 1. Slavery was reproductive coercion on a massive scale. Millions of enslaved women had no control over their own bodies, their own pregnancies, their own children. The disabled heir cases show how creative slave owners got. When inheritance was threatened, they used enslaved women as solutions. Legal, systematic, documented. Complexity doesn't mean equality. Some enslaved women developed relationships with the men who exploited them. That doesn't make those relationships consensual or acceptable. The children of these unions lived in limbo. Mixed-race heirs, legally recognized but socially ambiguous, carrying trauma that shaped American families for generations. 5. These stories were erased, intentionally. Families didn't want to admit that their wealth came from reproductive coercion, so they buried the evidence. But the evidence exists in WPA slave narratives, in plantation ledgers, in DNA tests revealing unexpected ancestry, in family secrets finally told. This channel exists to tell those stories, the ones that make people uncomfortable, the ones that show what slavery really meant. Because if we don't know the truth, we can't understand the present. And if we don't understand how systems of oppression actually functioned, we'll keep repeating their patterns in new forms. If this story hit you, share it. These stories need to be told. Subscribe for more original slave stories, 100% verified, brutally honest, impossible to forget. And if you want to go deeper, I've linked primary sources in the description. WPA narratives, plantation records, academic research on forced breeding. The truth is documented. The evidence is undeniable. Now you know what they didn't teach you in school. See you in the next one.